There is audio included in this video, so please put on your headphones and turn up the volume. This video is about TransCanada's accounts payable invoice processing for Mexico. In this short video, you will discover what you can do to help ensure that invoices are processed in a timely manner at TransCanada. Please note that the Procure to Pay overview is a prerequisite to this course. In the P2P overview, you saw TransCanada's end-to-end Procure to Pay process at a high level. In the AP invoice processing overview, we are going to focus on what happens in the last step of the P2P process, pay vendor. How does the vendor get paid? Who is involved? What do you need to know in order to ensure that AP has the right information to pay the vendor? At a high level, the sub-steps of pay vendor are pretty simple. The vendor sends TransCanada an invoice. The invoice is validated, and if it is a non-PO invoice, it is coded. There is a verification between the invoice, the receipt, and the purchase order if one exists. Then AP processes the invoice and pays the vendor. It seems simple enough. However, the process can break down if AP has been given incorrect data or is missing information. There are also a number of variances depending on whether or not the request was made using a purchase order. Let's go step by step to take a look at the rules and responsibilities. We are going to walk through the PO process and the non-PO process separately. First, we will look at the PO invoice process, starting from the point of receiving the invoice from the vendor. The vendor sends the invoice to TransCanada. Who gets this invoice? All invoices should be sent to accounts payable. However, if the invoice is mistakenly sent to the requester, then the requester must forward it to AP, including the XML and PDF versions of the invoice. When AP receives an invoice, they check the invoice to make sure that it has all the required information. If not, then they contact the vendor. AP will process the invoice in SAP and determines if a material or a services receipt has been completed against the purchase order. If the receipt is not in SAP, then the AP processor will contact the requester. Did the vendor send the invoice before TransCanada physically received the goods? Or have the goods been physically received but not yet entered in SAP? When this happens, communication is required between AP, the requester, and possibly the buyer. AP cannot pay the invoice until the receipt has been completed in SAP. The requester is responsible to ensure that the receipt is completed in SAP. Even if they are unable to perform the receipt themselves, the requester must communicate with someone who can perform the goods or services receipt. The requester should inform AP once the receipt has been completed in SAP. The invoice processor performs a three-way match to check if the invoice, the SAP receipt, and the PO are within allowable tolerance limits. If the three-way match is not successful, then more communication is required between AP, the requester, the buyer, and the vendor to resolve the discrepancy. If the three-way match is successful, the invoice is processed and the vendor is paid as per the terms on the invoice. This is the end of the PO invoicing process. As you have seen, there can be some issues along the way that would delay the vendor being paid on time. If you are a requester, there are two things that you can do to help ensure that the process goes smoothly. First of all, ensure that your purchase requisition is accurate and complete. Your purchase requisition must include your name so that AP knows who to talk to if there are any issues or questions. The second thing is to complete the receipt in SAP as soon as the goods are physically received or the services are rendered. Doing these two things will help considerably with the invoice processing time. Now we are going to have a look at the non-PO invoicing process. The non-PO process is used in cases such as emergencies, utilities, land, legal, contractual employees, taxes, and government fees. If you need to make a purchase without a purchase order, please inform the vendor that the following information must be on the invoice: contact name of the person at TransCanada who will provide the accounting coding, the vendor's remit-to address, and the correct legal name of the TransCanada company being charged. You can refer to the company name list on the AP in Focus page if you don't know this information. Also, remember to inform the vendor that the invoice should be sent directly to the TransCanada Mexico AP department. Let's take a look at the invoice processing steps now. The vendor sends the invoice to TransCanada. Remember, the invoice should be sent directly to AP, but if it is mistakenly sent to the requester, then the requester should forward it to AP. Invoice is validated and coded. AP validates that the invoice includes all the required information. If not, they return the invoice to the vendor. Once AP validates the non-PO invoice, they forward it to the requester to obtain accounting coding information. The coding must include the company code, general ledger account, cost object, vendor number, amount, and the name of the person who completed the coding. For Mexico, the coding information can be sent to AP via email. Once AP receives the coding information, they enter it into SAP. This triggers an approval workflow. Invoice is sent for ASL approval. Next, the invoice is sent via workflow for ASL approval. The approver will receive a notice and the invoice through SAP workflow. It is important that the approver reviews the notice and performs the approval in a timely manner. If the invoice receives ASL approval, then it is ready to be paid by accounts payable. AP pays the vendor as per the terms on the invoice. This is the end of the non-PO invoicing process. If you are a requester, remember that you can help with the process by providing the vendor with the information that is required on the invoice and by providing AP with the coding information in a timely manner. Most purchases at TransCanada should be done using a purchase order. Some exceptions allow you to use the non-PO process. There are also a few very specific exceptions that do not require an invoice at all. These exceptions follow the Request for Funds or RFF process. The RFF process should only be used when an invoice is not available. In cases where an invoice is not available, accounts payable will accept a Request for Funds form for the following types of payments: payments to tax authorities, land purchases, prepayments or guarantee deposits, confidential payments such as legal. To initiate the RFF process, download and complete the Request for Funds form located on the AP website. On the RFF form, you must include a business reason for making this payment and provide the location of backup documentation in case it is required by audit. The requester must sign the form, then email the RFF to accounts payable. AP reviews the form and communicates with the requester to have them fix any errors on the form. When the form is accurate and complete, AP processes the RFF in SAP as a non-PO. The RFF is sent for ASL approval through the SAP workflow. If the RFF receives ASL approval, then accounts payable follows their standard process for paying the vendor as per the due date indicated on the RFF form. This is the end of the RFF process. To expedite the payment, the requester should follow up with the ASL approver. This concludes our video on TransCanada's AP invoice processing. There are a few key things that you can remember to help ensure that invoices are processed in a timely manner. For PO-related purchases, the requester is responsible for the goods and services receipt in SAP. For non-PO purchases, the requester must let the vendor know what information to include on the invoice and where to send the invoice. For non-PO, the requester must also provide AP with the coding for the invoice. Accounts payable must always receive the invoice. If the vendor mistakenly sends the invoice to the requester, then the requester must forward it to AP. If no invoice exists, you must follow the Request for Funds process. Completing your steps in a timely manner will help TransCanada pay vendors efficiently. Remember to check out the Accounts Payable page on InFocus. It has a wealth of information to help you with invoice processing, such as how-to documentation, AP contact information, and frequently asked questions. Please close this window to return to the e-learning module, where you will get access to additional resources and answer some knowledge check questions.